Welcome to episode 9 of Lost Hollywood Horror Icon. This is the continued story of Benjamin Colt, a fictional Hollywood actor, his life and works. Lost Hollywood Horror Icon is sequential. If you have not watched the previous episodes in this video series, we encourage you to do so. Names, places, and events in this series are used in a fictional manner. Please, sit back and enjoy. "240 Maple Street was moved from Monday evenings at 6 o'clock to Tuesday evenings at 6:30. This was done as a power play by Walter Banks to prove to Kingman and Delaney that the show was indeed ending. Monday evenings were reserved by the network for what the executives judged to be the top shows with high ratings. Banks knew what he was doing to end the show by sending it to Tuesday nights. Many around the network believed his ego had been bruised by the success of season 5. However, it was also well known to the executive board that Tuesday nights had fewer television audiences. Kingman and Delaney shifted their focus this final season to Jenny, Charlene, and their friends. Ben Colt was fine with being in fewer episodes as long as he had his pay raise. Sam Gunnerman only stayed on to support Beverly. Emily McCall agreed to appear in some episodes, and Diane Iris remained in a support role as the high school secretary. Toward the middle of the season, Kingman and Delaney desperately tried to start spin-off shows with Charlene and her boyfriend Chris, as well as the Jenkins family at 280 Maple Street, to no avail. For the show's final Halloween episode, Graveyard of Terror, Matthew Delaney decided he would take charge of the teleplay. It aired on October 27, 1959. Matt decided he wanted to show that Grant Morris was on his way to becoming a brilliant filmmaker someday in honor of the young man portraying him, Benjamin Colt. The idea was to have a short movie within a television episode, which was directed by Grant over the course of a few months. Guest stars from previous Halloween episodes agreed to appear in this last offering, eager to work with Ben. Ben Colt only needed to have one look at the script and was quite pleased, telling Delaney he thought it to be perfect for the final Halloween of 240 Maple Street. It was Ben who made the suggestion of bringing back former guest stars, although he and Delaney would have different roles for them all to play. Since the episode was going to be done in color, Delaney and Ben wanted the costumes to be detailed with some bright hues mixed with black and gray shades. Delaney also wanted the makeup to stand out and made arrangements with his camera crew to focus on close-ups and multiple angles. Delaney told a reporter, "I really wanted my last Halloween show on 240 Maple Street to be a crowning achievement. I was pleased to discover viewers loved it, as a second favorite only to Year 5's Spook House. I really wished we could have gone a few more seasons, but the fates were no longer on our side." Delaney left the casting choices of the college couple in distress in the movie up to Ben. A friend of Grant's by the name of Bruce Johnson would portray the role of Tony Powell. In reality, Eric Cox was the actor, a good friend of Ben Colt's who had done some minor acting roles for television and stage. Eric had been one of few to support Ben while he was growing up in Golden Cove, putting on skits in the Colt backyard. It was finally the chance Ben had been looking for to work with Eric together in television. It was only natural for Grant to want Amanda Sellers to play the role of the college girl, Marcy Winston. Although she had officially left the show, Emily McCall had agreed to guest star in some episodes as previously noted. Since she'd left, the situation between Emily and Lynette had settled down by a great degree. Lynette's tantrums had become fewer and less intense than the previous year. Most of her bluster was now set off by members of the crew she thought incompetent. Lynette did get along well with Matthew's sister, Rachel, who had performed as Edith Thorne in Season 3's Halloween episode, Witching Hour. Rachel would be the first and only female to direct a Halloween episode, doing so with Graveyard of Terror. The episode opens with Grant ushering Warren, Nicole, and Jenny into a private screening room at a movie studio to reveal the movie he has been working on for the past few months. Grant had decided to try his hand at screenplay writing during the spring and had written a script which lasted about 40 minutes in film time. It was not so much a focus on plot as it was meant to give jolting scares. He had submitted it to a Hollywood producer without too much hope of it actually being considered. When it was green-lighted as a short film to be shot in the summer of 1959, Grant was ecstatic and began making plans immediately. The lights dimmed and the film began, showing the title Graveyard of Terror, a film by Grant Morris, starring Eric Cox and Emily McCall. It begins at a fabled college known as Mount Tri-Peaks University, located on the California coast. A party is going on between one of the fraternities and its sister sorority house. It started off innocently enough with pleasant conversation and a respectable tone. However, as the evening progressed, some of the frat boys secretly spiked the punch with alcohol. The party was now becoming loud and boisterous as the young adults slowly lost sobriety. One of the few sorority girls not taking part in the growing revelry was Marcy Winston. Marcy was a freshman who had grown up in a household with strict rules about partaking of alcohol at such a young age. She had joined the sorority only a few weeks before the present bash between the two houses. Marcy had allowed her roommate, Sarah Clements, to talk her into joining the sorority. Sarah was one of the most inebriated girls at the party currently, and Marcy was not about to let her roommate talk her into doing something she wanted nothing to do with. She had already had one drink already, not knowing it was spiked, and her head felt a bit fuzzy. Marcy figured she should probably leave the party now before anyone came over and talked her into making mistakes she would later regret. A tap on her shoulder startled Marcy, and she turned to see one of the more level-headed frat boys, Tony Powell, standing beside her. With the loud music over the phonograph player, Marcy had to ask him to repeat whatever it was he had just asked her. Leaning in close to her ear, Tony asked Marcy if she wanted to leave the party and go for a drive. Marcy glanced over and saw Sarah looking in her direction with 2 cups of punch in her hands, and quickly agreed to go with Tony. Once she got into the car, Marcy began to feel a little nervous being alone with a young man she hardly knew. Both of them were quiet as he drove along the highway. Fog was rolling in. The cool air helped clear Marcy's head, and she felt some of the fuzziness ebb away, although she did still feel a bit dizzy. Tony finally broke the ice by apologizing for the action of his frat brothers in spiking the punch. Marcy admitted to having had 1 glass. Tony smiled before stating he too had made the same mistake. Marcy knew Tony only as an acquaintance, since the two of them had been paired during Pledge Week to engage in some of the silly pranks the older students told them to do. Now, she hoped she had made the right choice by going on the drive with him. Marcy suddenly let out a shriek as an object loomed in the fog directly in front of the car. Tony swerved, going off the road and crashing into a drainage ditch to the side. Marcy trembled, her eyes closed, and let out a gasp as she felt Tony's hand touch her shoulder. He asked if she was all right, and after checking herself over and only finding a small cut on her forehead from where she had bumped it, told him she was fine. Tony tried the engine, but it refused to turn over. He got out of the car after telling Marcy he would be right back. After a few minutes of tense waiting, Marcy was about to get out of the car to see if he was all right. However, the driver's side door opened just at the moment she took hold of the door handle on the passenger side, and Tony offered her a crestfallen expression. He reported that he had smashed the front end of the car pretty good. They were going to have to get out and walk to find a service station or a house with a telephone to call for help from. Unfortunately for the college students, the area they were now in was sparsely populated. The two walked on the side of the road, and after noticing Marcy shiver, Tony gave her his jacket to wear. Both college students stared wide-eyed as the road ended at the gates of a cemetery. Tony pointed the flashlight he had brought along straight ahead through the open gates, but the fog was thick enough that neither of them could see very far ahead. It no longer mattered to Marcy that she hardly knew Tony. She took his hand, heart pounding as they began to step into the unknown. The double gates closed and locked by an unknown force silently behind them. A sign on one gate was revealed with bold letters reading, "Unhallowed ground, interred dead believed to be vampires." There was the sound of leaves rustling to their right as the college students walked along the bumpy dirt trail. But it was only the result of a slight breeze which had picked up. Trees loomed out of the fog, dark and twisted. Their branches reached out like arms with clawed hands. The fluttering of wings caused both of them to look up into the trees and see crows gathered on the limbs. In just above a whisper, Marcy told Tony there was something scary about these birds. They did not seem to act like normal crows. A dark shape running across the dirt trail caused Marcy to let out a loud gasp. Tony held on to her protectively. All became still, and too quiet. The pair moved forward again after Marcy let out a nervous whimper, picking up their pace. Another dark shape crossed in front of them, a woman wearing a flowing gown with long black hair. A chuckle sounded behind them, and Marcy caught sight of a second figure with long, pale blonde hair that streaked out behind her. A shape loomed ahead of them as they continued forward, and a stern-looking man emerged from the fog, glaring at the two of them. Marcy screeched and ran off to her right, while Tony ran back the way they had come. Tony tripped and fell on his belly over a large rock. Looking up, his eyes widened at the sight of a pale woman with long blonde hair, a hungry expression on her face. Getting to his feet, he bolted, running in the direction he knew the gate to be and calling for Marcy. The woman was directly behind him, her hand reaching out for him with clawed fingernails. And then suddenly she was gone, and he stopped to catch his breath. Another figure, smaller and more petite, stepped out of the fog in front of him. She was dressed in attire Tony remembered seeing in pictures from the 1920s, with black hair cut in a short bobbed style. She smiled at him in a nervous way, bright eyes shining in the beam of his flashlight. Shyly, the young woman stated she was lost and asked if he would help her find the way out of the cemetery. Marcy had taken off her high heels and held them in one hand as the strange man pursued her. She ducked behind a tree after having run as fast as she could in her stocking feet. The sound of footsteps behind her was now gone, and Marcy called out to Tony, receiving no reply. Deciding to find the trail again, Marcy shrieked after she turned around and almost walked into a pale woman with long black hair. The woman laughed in a raspy way, revealing the fangs of a vampire. Marcy let out a scream of terror and ran in the opposite direction of the trail once again. She called out desperately for Tony, her heart pounding, her side developing a painful stitch as Marcy panted hard. Laughter rang out as the woman pursuing her flew over Marcy's head and vanished into the fog. Marcy stopped abruptly, not wanting to face the vampire, and ran once again toward the trail. Large pale hands reached out of the fog ahead of her and took hold of the terrified college girl. The hands belonging to a second man, unusually tall, lifted Marcy off her feet. Baring his vampire fangs, he bit into her neck. Marcy's eyes went wide and she let out a wet, gurgling noise, dropping her shoes before the fog closed in on the pair. The night turned to day and the fog cleared. During daylight hours, the old cemetery seemed to be at peace. Wind blew dead leaves around, and even the old mausoleums with their usual gloom seemed less than sinister. All was silent until after sunset, and the lid of a coffin opened in one of the mausoleums to reveal Marcy lying inside, her red hair contrasting with pale skin. Her eyes snapped open as another coffin next to hers opened. She and Tony sat up simultaneously and peered at one another. The newest vampire residents smiled at each other sinisterly, revealing their fangs. Other coffins opened in the gloom, and humanoid figures transformed into the forms of crows as twilight came, and the mausoleum doors opened, ending the episode. The 5 vampires encountered by Marcy and Tony were the guest stars, including Rick Castle, who had played Reuben Hodge in Witching Hour, twin sisters Leslie and Gretchen Foster, also from Witching Hour, Dawn Gardner from The Haunted School, and Dan Olson, who had performed in The Spook House. As noted, all 5 were thrilled to return, and stated publicly they had fun shooting this episode. Many viewers were shocked to find out Emily McCall had agreed to her character becoming a vampire in the end. Emily simply stated, "I was fine with the decision. Why not play something scary for the first time in my career?" Ben answered the question as to why Tony and Marcy didn't go in the opposite direction of the cemetery after leaving the car. The two of them knew there was no help in the other direction for quite some distance without a car. They were scared to cross the graveyard, but saw it as the only way to get out of the mess they were in. As 240 Maple Street came to an end, Kingman told Ben he could go far in the industry as a writer and director. Ben wanted, as always, to be a master of the horror genre, and was always grateful to the producer and Delaney for the chance given him for acting experience. Head Mechanic was the episode choice of viewers for the final season. It aired on January 19, 1960. Having now worked at the auto garage for 2 years, Grant was promoted to the position of head mechanic after his predecessor retired. Although young, Grant had proven over the short time that he knows his way around car and motorcycle engines. The owner of the garage goes on further to appoint Grant as the co-owner. During a holdup, a masked robber is sorry after he tangles with Grant, who renders the man helpless by using tools to defend himself. Ben Colt also co-wrote this episode, wanting to prove that not everyone needed to go to college to achieve success. The viewers agreed with him, even though many of them were still irked at how he had demanded more money just prior to the final season. Ben would go on to prove his point in not needing higher education when he continued making movies after 240 Maple Street as a successful career. The one souvenir Ben kept from his days on the show was the giant box wrench prop Grant used to knock the crook unconscious with. And so ended 240 Maple Street with 7 seasons after the last episode, tying the knot when Grant and Amanda are married after her first year of college ends. The original plan was for Grant and Amanda to marry after she finished work on her degree. Since the show was being canceled, though, Delaney declared the wedding would happen in this final episode. The finale premiered on April 19, 1960, bringing the series to a close with a total of 206 episodes. What was most exciting for Ben Colt was when he got to meet Alfred Hitchcock briefly in December 1959, while the master of suspense was shooting Psycho. Ben enjoyed the thriller when it came out the next year. 240 Maple Street had indeed opened doors for Ben, as his father had predicted. What opportunities would the 1960s bring for Benjamin Colt? What was next for the rest of the main cast of 240 Maple Street? Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us for the 240 Maple Street Season 7 Halloween episode, Graveyard of Terror. Please stay tuned for Episode 10 of Lost Hollywood Horror Icon, coming soon. This has been a Zane's Dungeon production. Lost Hollywood Horror Icon comes from notes written by Mark Goodman. Thank you for viewing. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share.